Fence reactivity in dogs can be funny. It can be scary somewhat, but it can also be funny. There's this one dog, sweet, sweet dog. You know, he has his own little quirks. Like, he doesn't like some of the newer dogs out there. He doesn't really start anything, but he'll just like watch them and then go up to them and then tag them with his snout on occasion. But it's funny when he goes home. I get him into the catwalk to go home. He's all quiet, looking at me like, you know, it's good being here, mister. I'll see you later. And then he gets through the gate, and then there's dogs on the other side of the fence, and he'll just run along the fence at full speed, and he's barking like, F you, go to hell, I'm going to kick your butt, F you. And then he'll get to the door, and then the receptionist will open the door to get his leash on and everything. And then at that point, he's quiet and sweet again. They can be hilarious with their fence reactivity sometimes.
Oh, yes. Being raised around dogs, like I often joke that I got along with dogs more than people because I think I'm just going to start calling her, instead of my bio mom, my personal Karen. Because I've got Step Monster and my personal Karen. So my personal Karen took in a lot of dogs. We actually did like dog breeding for a while. But can confirm they are quirky. They have fun personalities. Dogs are awesome. I mean, cats are awesome too. Pretty much all of the animal spectrum I like more than most people. So they're all pretty great. Ferrets are feisty, fun, a little bit smelly, but all normally better than half of the roommates I've had in my life.
Well, thanks.
I said half. Come on, that puts you in a
Okay.
fair 50-50 demographic, Tim. Don't take it personally.
Okay, I promise.
Keep in mind,
But,
this is college too. Like, you want to talk about, at least when you find random shit in a corner with a dog or an animal, like it is literal shit versus roommates. Sometimes it could be just mysteries. Like, I actually had an agreement with a roommate when I lived in Arizona that we'd have like honest roommate moment. And it was anytime the smell from the random pack rat level crap in his room started to permeate the hallway, I was allowed to demand that he clean his room.
yeah, a simple ask, yeah. Oh, and dogs too can be weird because of what they eat. What they eat. Let's put it that way. Like where I work, we don't have food out in the main yard for the dogs or anything like that for obvious reasons. Some are going to get
Right.
territorial and start fights.
Food aggression is a thing, yeah.
Yeah, but that doesn't stop some of the dogs from, walking through the yard, seeing a nice pile of poop that's out there and go, that looks delicious, and starts going nuts. Yeah, I
I
mean,
know
we
it's
got
not an active choice. I know it's like some urge or something in their brain, but
yeah, and it's bad too because we got a couple that like we're the handlers we got there now. Thank goodness are pretty good at catching them and getting them as quickly as possible. But on certain days with certain dogs, like they find it before us, and it's just like there'll be times where like I'll see it, I'll grab the scooper to head out into the yard, but then the other dog sees me with the scooper and like a laser is like pointing at the poop, and then all of a sudden zips to it before I get to it and eats it up. It's like, why did you do that? Why did you do that? It's like, thanks for the
dogs.
help, I guess, but still.
Dogs be dogging.
Yeah, but also the fence reactivity too. I do remember at the other location, they have private rooms. There are some dogs that just don't work well in groups. But, with the private room, they're able to, just chill and relax and do whatever. I was assigned to the private rooms, and there was one dog. I go in there, and the sweetest thing, patted it, and it showed me around like, this is my blanket, this is my little dinosaur. I put it in my mouth and go like that. But once I took another dog out for a walk, all of the dogs, including the one that showed me his dinosaur and was real nice, once again were screaming, barking at the top of their lungs like, hey, go to hell, I'm gonna get you, son of a bitch, I'm gonna get you.
Oh my gosh.
I had to laugh. It was hilarious.
Dogs. Oh, doggo antics.
Yes, they are funny, but look at this, folks. Our friends are here. This is Tim the Nerd, and I'm joined by the Reverend Tracy. This is Friends Talking Nerdy. We are continuing on with Illusions Month, and this week we are going to talk about the illusion of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps.
I love it because this phrase is still used inappropriately. It's got a fun history, and I think we've even nodded to it in the past. I don't recall if you get to it in your notes. I do look at them before we start. I just don't always remember every bit of it, especially like when it's a tidbit that was already locked in my brain. But yeah, that phrase dates back, I think, to like an old book, if I'm remembering correctly. But what I do recall about it was the intention behind it was to convey impossibility. Like it was supposed to be like, that's an impossible task, like pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. You can't do that. And it's just so funny how far we have come and completely lost that with how it's being applied as if it's like, you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That's what you do, Tim. Are you poor? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Are you struggling with mental health? Just take those little bootstraps and give them a little tuggy tug. So I love that we're getting to talk about this because I think it is one of our most profound, if I could name it, an illusion statement in our culture. This is one of them, that you can do this, that this was ever really supposed to be a possible concept, like physically or using as a metaphor.
Yeah, because it basically, and we'll get into it as we go through the notes. But basically, it's used by people that just want to dismiss the fact that life is not fair for everyone. What do I mean by fair? Not everybody in this country or in this world has a fair shot at the same level of upward mobility as other people. There are a lot of factors that can go into that, and laying the blame on somebody who, just by the sheer fact of geography, has a lot more hurdles going their way than anybody else for not being able to become what people consider successful. Because I think that's another thing too, especially in the United States, is definitely quite interesting. And pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I can just imagine someone like Ted Cruz saying that, and then you want to smack him in the face. Being that he's a politician, I'm going to say I don't endorse violence, blah, blah, blah. Don't go smack him in the face for real, but don't put me on a jury either.
Yeah, don't actually do it, and don't quote us saying the Friends Talking Nerdy podcast told me to do it. We're not that influential, I don't think. A and B, this is us saying, but don't. Like, Ted Cruz is just hilarious to me because that's Texas. You guys that have listened for a while know that that's where I'm from, y'all. And a storm's getting bad when Teddy catches a flight.
Yeah, like I just don't get how he keeps getting reelected. Like, he also is one person that makes me really skeptical of the media too, because his last two elections, like the media that I listened to at the time of those elections, each time was like, oh, his opponent's in the lead, and then Ted Cruz has a comfortable victory. That shows you about biases in the media. But what do I mean by the biases? I think there were people that were hoping for Ted Cruz to not be elected, so they were glamming onto any bit of like polling news that could make it sound like Ted Cruz was losing, and
Yeah.
that type of bias, and I'm sure we can go into that on a later subject or whatever, is something to
Yeah.
look into in your meeting.
I feel like, as a side note, Ted Cruz continually being reelected is just such the epitome of Texas culture of, if it ain't broke bad enough, don't fix it. Rather have the one that we know how it works and know all of the weird ways I have to work around it not working properly than get a new fucking tractor. Like, that is just, I don't know, it always cracks me up. But no, they're stuck with him until January 2031 because 2024, it's a 6-year term.
Yeah,
Unless something happens, unless he misses one of those flights or one of those flights runs into something, he's around for a while.
Yeah. This year they have the senator election is for the other seat in Texas,
Yeah.
and one of the Republican choices, their current the Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, quite the character. His wife left him openly for what she calls biblical terms. So the word around the street is that he's cheated on her multiple times. He's been impeached by Republicans in Texas. The impeachment was not successful, so he kept his job and everything like that. But because he was endorsed by Mango Mussolini, you know,
My gosh.
he's in the runoff.
Yeah, there's no credibility to this, but it is funny. I just recently reconnected with another old friend back in Texas, and we were talking about Paxton. And since, they live there, I was like, who the fuck is Paxton? Because I know Tallarico. Tallarico is the one that he did win the Democratic. He seems to be doing really well. And I guess one of the rumors that they're thinking that the biblical term thing meant was that potentially he cheated on her with a man or something like that. Something along those lines. No credible. I'm going to huge asterisk that that's not from anywhere credible. It's just the whispers on the street from a friend who lives there. But yes, that's going to be some interesting times.
Yes, yes. God bless America and God bless Texas. Anyway,
God bless Texas. There's a song about it. You should listen to it. It's good.
no, it's not. I've heard that song.
Hey, we all learned a line dance to that fudging song. Don't hate too bad.
Yeah. No, I'm gonna hate. I'm gonna hate. That
Texas
deserves
physical
that.
education involves line dancing sometimes. That's all. Anyway.
I'm glad we did. Well, man, because it was Henry Ford. Another side tangent. Henry Ford, I guess, didn't like jazz or something like that. So he, and with his vast wealth, helped spread the teaching of square dancing in schools. So it was a racist thing. It was a racist thing. Let's be clear. But he was trying to he helped teach square dancing in schools because he wanted to fight against that.
Gotcha. I could also see it as a bit of like that almost Puritan vibe, though, because with swing, there's a lot more touching between bodies, whereas line dancing, there's not. So if you're encouraging kids to learn a form of dancing, there may have been some religious culture kind of peppered in there too, by the way. Like, I'm not saying, because, right, I didn't look into it, but I could see that. I could see that being the ultimate reason why is they don't want the girls touching the boys, right? It's the same reason our dances suddenly very abruptly got cut off after middle school. No more school dances after middle school for a lot of us in Texas, at least for my day and age anyway. You'd have homecoming and prom.
No, we had dances in Michigan, but it was all super awkward. Like I went to one and danced once, and it was the most awkward dance I ever had. But anyway, yeah, imagine that, me having an awkward interaction with a female at any point in my history.
Oh, what? No, I can't imagine that at all.
Yeah, it never happens. But anyway, back to pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, folks. As you mentioned, the phrase itself is a paradox. It comes from the 19th century, and it is. It was originally intended as a joke about impossibilities because bootstraps. If you think about it, it's if you have boots, they're the little loops on the back of your boot that you can use them to pull on your boots, because like cowboy boots, for instance, are pretty big, and they don't necessarily easily slide on, and if they do slide on pretty easily, then your foot's going to be all over the place in there. They got to be pretty snug, so the bootstraps help pull it up. But if you are in a horizontal position and try to pull your bootstraps up, that's not going to put you in an upright position, folks. It's impossible. And yet this phrase has suddenly become this weird sort of motivation to people to keep on working because you might win that one lottery ticket that can make you rich.
Exactly. And just as a quick side note, because I wanted to see where it came from, I was like, yes, it was a satirical American publication. But apparently, and I just learned this, it has an earlier influence. The idea connects to exaggerated stories like those of Baron Munchausen in the 1700s, who supposedly pulled himself and even a horse out of a swamp by his own hair. So it's kind of got a longer background than even I knew until just now. of kind of that being the hyperbolic of like that's not possible. It's
Uh,
like
spe-
fantastical stories about a man, right? Like not possible.
Side tangent on Baron Munchausen. Are you familiar with the late 80s Terry Gilliam movie, The Adventures of Baron Munchausen?
No, I'm not.
It has a special cameo from one Robin Williams in it. He was
Oh,
uncredited, but he was in the movie, and they did use him for like the promo stuff and anything like that. But like most Terry Gilliam movies, it wasn't exactly successful at the box office. But it's also one of those films that people found later on and definitely have a soft spot for. Terry Gilliam's the guy who did Time Bandits.
gotcha, gotcha. But yeah, so just funny side note that actually dates back, I guess, a little bit further, even as far as the inspiration for the idea.
Yeah. But again, what we are examining here is how it got turned into some sort of weird motivation, because we want to ask, is success purely individual effort, or is it a team sport disguised as a solo act? One thing too we also want to acknowledge up front is that we're not we're not questioning whether hard work equals success, because we don't want people to feel like they're being attacked for the work they put in. There are people that do put in a lot of hours to support a business. Like, I think of the owner of my business. The beauty of working with a small business is that I can have a personal relationship with the owner, and seeing the work that she and her husband do, keeping everything going. Like, I couldn't do it for that type of work, for that type of work, because there's a lot of interacting with, the pet parents, talking about stuff that that would burn me out quite quick. But she's been able to, do it for close to 20 years now, which is awesome. But, we're not talking about that. What we're talking about is why this phrase is not helpful, why this phrase is ultimately something that it can be used by people to kind of dismiss some of the setbacks that people have in their lives for whatever reason. Like they talk about the term white privilege, for instance, and we will get into privilege later on, not only for stuff like race and everything like that, but there are people that just do have better advantages. And
Right. And
yeah,
there's even stories where like, yeah, they do try and try and try and they give it their fudging everything and they do get a good result. And I think about the best example that most people probably know since it got turned into a Will Smith movie with the asterisk, of course, some Hollywoodization in there, The Pursuit of Happiness. But unfortunately, that's not just his story, right? There's actually a lot of people, probably more than make it, that can do all of those things and still fail in essence. Like they don't get to achieve their goals. And there really is like some interesting research around that too that got studied to understand why people blame victims of injustice. And essentially, people are motivated to believe the world is fair. And that leads them to interpret outcomes as deserved. Therefore, you didn't try hard enough. And so that supports the belief that success and failure are earned because we actually like hope. I know that that kind of sits in like a negative sense, but really, does that not sound like it's trying to almost soothe people by saying you can have control over this? When really that's just not fact. But that goes into those biases where we want to believe certain things are possible, right? It just kind of aligns that it's not necessarily that people want to demonize the person. It really more comes from they want hope for themselves. And there's a lot invested in having hope that you can try hard enough and get out of an impoverished background, right? That you can, even as silly as win the lottery, because you just got to play. You can't win if you don't play, so that you can have that hope to pursue your happiness, right?
I think too that does speak to that peculiar American obsession with wealth. I mean, because bettering your financial situation doesn't have to mean, you go from poverty to being a billionaire. It could be poverty to just comfortable middle class. And there is nothing wrong with that, but we don't shine a light on the people that are able to pull themselves up to, for lack of a better phrase here, to comfortable middle class. Those are just everyday people. We don't shine a light on them. What we want to do in this country, at least, is, look at your big time billionaires and be like, how can I be them? And if we all were them, then there wouldn't be a rich people, right? It would all be the same at that point. Only, anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but do you have any story of how somebody helped you along the way for something? Were there times to where you received help for a situation that that you could not have done on your own?
Yes. And I can think of two major examples. And you know what? I'll give my personal Karen this one because she actually did really make the difference in my life at one point. Because when I had my roommates in little Tempe, Arizona, there was a time where I was starting to get sick because the only thing I could afford outside of rent was top ramen. And top ramen is just high sodium, no nutrients. It is enough to make you feel like you just have food in you. And I was starting to get sick. And the thing that really, really turned it around was Karen sent me, I think it was like a loaf of bread and some peanut butter as a care package because, she had benefits and could go get like food pantry stuff. So it was actually cheaper for her to just ship it at the time in like a flat rate box than to send me money for the things. And that totally helped enough. That was like the little domino that helped me be able to afford other things because then it's like, okay, I'm not buying top ramen. I can go get myself some jelly because, right, it was in a glass jar. So she didn't send that. But I went and got myself some jam. And then I was able to, like, instead of buying like top ramen and stuff like that, like got other little accoutrement. So I could actually like have a varied diet. Not great still, but better. And then fast forward when I went through one of my more harsh breakups with my ex fiance, I had kind of nowhere to go. And I crashed on my friend's couch for a while. Like she was in this very small studio situation, and it was me, her, and my cat, which was super crowded. And unfortunately, that caused strain. And we kind of had like we didn't really have a blow up, so to speak, but we did drift after that. And while like I'm not upset with her, and as far as I know, she's not upset with me, I will always be thankful for that. And that is just two, right? Like I live under no veil that I have only survived based on my own skills. A lot of us probably have a lot of help out there that have gotten us through moments in time. And ideally you're looking for those to give other people too, right? Because that's like kind of the benefit of being tribal and having your group.
Yeah, for me, I can think back to when I was actively writing online more, and the dominoes that helped the podcast come to life started with a blog I did where I reviewed a comic book a day, and that got enough notice that out of nowhere, a recruiter for the website Latino Review Media reached out to me and was like, "Hey, we like your work. Do you want to write for us?" And I don't know if you're familiar with Latino Review Media, but they're still around. They were kind of similar to like the Ain't It Cool News people. They have basically reviews on like popular movies that are out and behind the scenes news that comes and everything like that. But that was a lucky break for me. It wasn't a situation to where my blog in and of itself was enough to reach the amount of people that Latino Review Media did, because each month I believe they still do like over 1 million views a month and everything. But it was just that one lucky moment to where one of the people from that organization reached out to me, and I ended up getting that break. Now, obviously, I don't write for LRM anymore. I left them like shortly after we met, because it was just not for me, because they wanted me to write about stuff I just had zero interest in, and why do it at that point if you have no interest in doing it? That ultimately led to what we're doing today. But it was that lucky break, and it came out of nowhere. It wasn't something I actively searched for. I wasn't spamming their email to get them to pay attention to me. They reached out to me, and there are countless examples throughout history of people that ended up getting big because of a lucky break. And we'll obviously go into a few of them as we go along here, but stuff like that kind of shows that getting ahead in life is a team effort, and we need to recognize that. All right,
It's not.
now,
It's very rarely a one man show. This life, you know.
uh, because it's really not. Period. I mean, that's the illusion here, folks. Like, even people like an Abraham Lincoln, for instance, had help to get to the point to where he did in life. That is just a fact, and it's like you. I have no problem with pushing people to work hard. There's nothing wrong with working hard. We're not trying to say you shouldn't work hard, but success is a relative term at the end of the day. The
Yeah,
working, yeah, it's like you
I
shouldn't.
think. Yeah, it's important to bring up basically an essence of if you feel like you're failing. 'Cause this is kind of a little bit of that mental health tie-in, just to kind of point it out. Of if you're trying, you're not failing, if that makes sense. Like if you're finding motivation to keep trying, that in and of itself is a success. So if you feel like you are giving it your all and not succeeding, this is going to be one of those messages of it's not you, and let's understand why it's not you.
Exactly. And even if you have like a small business that lasts for 20, 30, 40 years, but ends up closing down at some point for whatever reason, again, not a failure. I mean, unless we're talking about you and, used some of the budget for the business to go to Vegas and, give money to showgirls or anything like that, you're not a failure. Anyway, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, it kind of got its start-ish around the Gilded Age, thanks to people like Dale Carnegie and John Rockefeller, names that, we don't necessarily know who they are today, but their names are still quite prevalent in our society. Think of Carnegie Hall or, in New York, Rockefeller Center, for instance. Those two people aggressively promoted their humble origins while also being jerks, when it comes to their business. I mean, because their era, the Gilded Age, in a lot of ways mirrors what we're experiencing now, to where you have a very small group of business people that have most of the money, and with the lack of regulations that are out there, we're able to get away with practices that the average person would not necessarily agree with. Like I forgot which one did it. Standard Oil in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that would like aggressively put as many of their own gas stations around the country as they could to choke out the little mom and pop shops, similar to what Walmart did. I think we can take this notion of celebrity or rich people worship and look at what happened during the Gilded Age and see that these people did kind of promote the myth that they did come up from nothing, and yet they had a lot of help along the way, and a lot of that help too, once they were rich, did come from a government that didn't push back on their practices.
Right, because they very much indulged in monopolistic practices, political connections, and cheap labor, and that is taking advantage of your resources in a sense, but that's still not the same as doing it alone. I did find there is something called narrative identity theory that was studied by one Dan McAdams, and that was studied to try to understand like how people construct life meaning. And basically, what they found is people build life stories emphasizing personal agency while minimizing external help. Like this is something that we do, whether we realize it or not, and it kind of explains that persistence of self made narratives. Like when people are successful, they tend to really emphasize how hard they worked and what all they did, and kind of unintentionally downplay who all helped them. And since we've talked a lot about how our memory works, it gets really easier over time to convince yourself that you didn't have that much help, or that for some reason that help didn't count because something about you sought it out, right? Like, so it's kind of, like I said, narrative identity theory, kind of interesting stuff to look at if you want to.
Yeah, and you hear a lot of like athletes, for instance, that want to become political, kind of have that mentality as well of because a lot of times you will find, and it's not everybody, of course, but there are a fair number of athletes in regardless of the sport that do kind of lean more on the conservative side. And, those ones do tend to have that pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality because they do have that mindset of, well, I did it, while not thinking of, as you mentioned, the help they had along the way to get to a point to where they could shine in athletics. And, even in athletics, if you think about it, like football, for instance, look at the sheer amount of college football teams. And we're not talking just Division One. There's Division One, two, and three. Like there are hundreds upon hundreds of them. And those college teams are essentially, let's be honest, the minor leagues for the National Football League. The National Football League, I believe, only has like 32 teams. Only like 50 or so players can be on a team at any particular time. So not everybody that plays in college will get an opportunity to play in the NFL. Yet you have your Tom Brady types that, that noted conservative that will come out and, it was all me. It was all me. No, it wasn't. And Tom Brady himself is the one who got lucky because the only reason he ended up getting his position was I forgot the year, but it was one of the first years that Bill Belichick was the coach of the New England Patriots, and his starting quarterback was Drew Brees. But Drew Brees ended up getting injured, and then his sub was Tom Brady. Tom Brady got lucky. And once he had that opportunity to go out onto the field, the coach was like, you know what? I like you better. And then Drew Brees ended up getting traded. But he got lucky. If Drew Brees did not get injured, Tom Brady would not have had that opportunity.
Didn't Drew Brees, that sounds familiar. Did he end up going over, you said this is college or professional?
A professional, he was in the New England
Yeah.
Patriots. I think he might have played for the Cowboys at some
I was
point too.
gonna say, yeah, I want to say Drew Brees was one of those Cowboy players after I done gave up on watching them because I got tired of watching them lose. Hey, I'll be
Well,
honest.
imagine being a Detroit Lions fan, but yeah, at least you guys won some Super Bowls closer to the 21st century than not.
Oh my God, we have I can't even think the Cowboys haven't won a Super Bowl in forever, but they keep like glamming onto that one victory like ages ago. I feel like, I mean, they did for a while and then they just stopped. But anyway, we don't need to go
Yeah,
into Cowboys history.
yeah, it's pretty pathetic. Anyway, now there is one person in history that is kind of the beacon of light here for this whole pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality that we can thank, and that's one Benjamin Franklin. Now this, yeah, he is a noted figure in American history for a reason. He did a lot of great stuff for this for this country, but he, in a lot of ways, was a showman. Let's put it that way. He wrote the Poor Richard's Almanac, and with his own biography, he did his own self-branding. He put his idea of what he wanted the average person to think about him out there, and that was this whole idea that he did it himself, when the fact was, with his history, he grew up rich, he had privilege, and he was able to do everything he did thanks to the connections and the privilege that he did have, which does not take away from the accomplishments that he did do. But if you have, it would be like in 100-meter dash race. If it was him and somebody else, essentially he would be put 50 meters ahead and then told to start the race, and the other person 50 meters behind would have to try and catch up. That's essentially what we're talking about here with Benjamin Franklin. Again, not to dismiss the work that he did, because he did a lot of great stuff, let's be honest, but he wasn't the self-made figure that he wanted to present himself to be, and that general history has kind of made him out to be.
Right. It's kind of funny because you tell that story and it makes things like, okay, so it's kind of the opposite of Teddy Roosevelt because of the whole story behind the teddy bear. Like they tried to tie this bear to a tree, I believe, and wanted him to shoot it. And he's like, no, I don't want the 10 yards ahead on a race. I don't want the cheat. So and it's funny because it goes back to that probably got reworked in his head that for some reason that still justified a win, and that comes to some of those biases, and we'll talk about more as we go down. But you guys know me; I've always peppered in how biases come into play. So.
Yeah, that's why you love us, folks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, also too, think about another popular time in this country's history that we love to mythologize, and that's frontier living. You have the frontier mentality, this rugged individualism on the frontier. It erases kind of the advantages that these people had during that time. And there was the time of westward expansion, which was subsidized by the government. You had the Homestead Act, you had railroads, and it was also, let's be honest, built on stolen land. We weren't exactly kind to the Native Americans in this country, and we stole a lot of their land. And if you're just going to steal a bunch of land and then just essentially give it to people to start, I mean, it's like, yeah, it took hard work to build the farms, to tend the farms and all that stuff. But if you were essentially, again, like the analogy I used with Ben Franklin, they were put on the 50-yard line of a 100-meter, 100 at the 50-meter line of a 100-meter dash run, and told to start the race at the 50-meter line. And that's why they were able to have the success they did. They had advantages that people don't want to talk about.
Exactly. And yeah, like we don't and it's funny cuz like now that you phrase that because we've come off of having the multi-generational home not too long ago and it's almost like these times in American culture that we refer to as this golden era actually had a lot of government subsidy kind of holding it up and bringing it to fruition, right? Because we talked about that with like some of the GI Bill and everything and how it really made housing cheaper. And now that we've taken away all of that, it's gone back to everything's really expensive. A studio apartment is $3,000 a month and, everything's unaffordable. So yet again, we're learning that one of these golden eras that really love to be promoted as a time when people were picking themselves up by their bootstraps, because that is the same messaging, right? The reason we don't own homes is because we like Starbucks, remember? Like that's the whole thing. It's our fault that we don't own homes. And it goes back to that we need to believe, it seems, that we have more control over our outcomes than we actually have. Right? There's no strings in the background that actually made it better for people during these times. There was no Homestead Act. There was no GI Bill making housing insanely cheap to build and getting people out of apartments and multi-gen homes. That wasn't really real. So we're going to just, and like I said, and as we've emphasized in the show before, anytime there's something on the individual scale, we can probably plus size it to our culture as a whole. So it goes back to what I just shared about that need to believe in almost downplay external help. So, as that American culture, that American stereotype of success and rugged individualism is that we did it ourselves, that something about our culture in those times did it without the help. But the reality is, when you look at it, there's a lot of help, and there also is a hair of luck.
Also, too, I don't believe we brought this up in the MGH episode, but during the 50s, the top 1% in this country had a 91% tax rate.
Well, how did that miss my research? That's delicious. I'm going to take a sip of my coffee for that one. Pinky up style, guys.
Yeah, and the pinky is up, folks.
Yeah, he can confirm because we use videos so our conversation feels more natural. But yeah. That's super fascinating to know. Actually, I did not glean that. I never realized that our tax rate was that high for the 1%.
Yeah, and imagine that too. During the time that the uber rich were taxed like that, we had the national expansion of the highway system. We had a lot of infrastructure work happening in this country. This golden age that people want to say was self-made, for instance, again, was another thing that the government helped with. And am I saying that we need to necessarily go back to the 91%? Not necessarily, but it doesn't need to be as low as it is for the uber rich now. Because I know I've brought this up on the show before. Like Warren Buffett has publicly commented that when it comes to like income tax, for instance, his secretary pays more in income tax than pays more, not just in income tax, but just taxes overall. Percentage wise, his secretary pays more in taxes than he does, because being that he is super rich, he's able to get a lot more tax breaks than his secretary. And being Warren Buffett's secretary, you got to assume at minimum they're getting at least a 6-figure salary, maybe a 7-figure salary. But still, the fact that they're paying more in taxes than Warren Buffett is ridiculous.
I will say, before you all get really up in a twist about this idea that people maybe should be taxed more when they hold most of the wealth, is we have to understand money is not just money. It is actually a resource. And we are not allowed, or should not be allowed, to hoard resources from each other. And that is effectively the argument behind why they should be taxed more, is because it got a lot of it got taken away with the whole mentality around trickle down economy, right? That this whole thing is that they were going to naturally want to do it because we're going to incentivize and do this stuff as long as they're giving it da, 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 da. But the problem is they're giving it more to that it technically fulfills like being a nonprofit, and those nonprofits aren't necessarily serving the areas that need it most. The areas that are having a resource deprivation are not being served right now. So as far as that whole trickle down economy concept, that seems to be failing, right? Because look at what we're dealing with. And so when you look at it as a resource, because that's what it is, and that we would not allow anybody to hoard water. We would not allow anybody to hoard all of the food to the same level that we seem to be okay with hoarding money in this country. So that's just something, that's where I like, when I say, like, I know I've expressed that I do have a lot of conservative value, but I do have some progressive ones as well. But some of my conservative values also realizes that some of these bigger golden eras existed under different like subsidies and things like this going on, right? That things just worked differently. But now, because of our current culture, it's not working anymore. So I think it's time to go back and tax them more and make sure they're not hoarding resources from people, because unfortunately, and this is funny because it's something I said to the Mr. Reverend lately about some of our life goals, is I don't necessarily want to be about all the money, but unfortunately that is the resource you need to succeed in this country. And I know it was a long episode, but a lot of that financial burden really becomes clear when you look at what we lost with our multi generational homes, right? Like, we have to pay for a lot more things now than ever in our human history, especially here in America, because it goes back to, this has only been about 8 decades worth of time that we've kind of struggled and had to institutionalize these things that used to be baked into our raising.
Well, and you mentioned about hoarding. I mean, I think back to, I believe it was our water bottle episode where we talked about how these companies that do make bottled water are essentially hoarding the water from areas of the country that at times may need it. I believe it was in Maine, for instance. I
Hmm.
forgot the company, but it was a local community that did sign over some water rights to a water bottling plant. And all of a sudden there was a drought or something, and the company that had signed the contract would not allow the people to have the water, even though they desperately needed it.
Yeah, you're talking about Poland Spring. That was the water company. I actually remember because pretty sure that happened either while we were living in Maine or very close to when we moved, because I do remember it being relevant in the conversation and everybody talking about it. But yeah, I want to say that got kiboshed, right? But yeah, it was real company and real water extraction. Taking all the water was a bit of an exaggeration, as it turned out, because, right, you heard the news from across the country. Yes, we did talk about it there, but it did kind of seem to not be as dire. It was a genuine local concern about scale and fairness, but it wasn't necessarily that nobody had water. There was
Gotcha.
just issues going on around it, right? But even then, that is not still going on, right? Like things get brought to attention. So it just goes back to we don't like if we catch somebody hoarding something, it does kind of get more correction than when we're hoarding money. That is something that is kind of openly encouraged in American culture, is that is the one resource we are allowed to hoard right now and have been given cultural permission to not feel bad about it because hoarding money is viewed as success here for some reason.
For some reason, but then, if you take a look at the Gilded Age time, what ended that? Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was the right politician at the right time that helped kind of break up those monopolies and, kind of lead America into the 20th century with as much of a fair balance as it could. Let's be honest. Like, is there ever going to be a world to where every single person in the United States has the same opportunity to be successful or not? No, it's not going to happen. But we can fight to make sure that as many people as possible have that ability to do so, and also do stuff like taxes to make it to where there are programs out there that can help people. Now, with those programs, because we do want to address the conservative side of things, we do want to make sure that those programs are effective, that the money we put into it is actually showing some result. Because I think one fair critique you can have of democratic policies, at least in the 70s and 80s, is, and some would argue later, but I would say probably not, thanks to the Clintons and all that, is that Democrats did have a bit of a history of let's just throw money at something and it will go away. Not true. And I'm being simplistic there, and I don't have specific examples. So if I'm hilariously wrong, people, feel free to correct me. But, while that is a stereotype, I guess there was some truth to that. But anyway, the American
It's
dream.
okay. You can
Go
you can
ahead.
always explain something like we're five. That does not mean explain it like we're stupid. So if we're wrong about anything, we're always open to that. But yes, the American dream versus reality, right?
Yes, the American dream is that idea that it's the rags to riches story, that you can start in you can be living in a cardboard box and then 5 years later be running a multinational company. That's the American dream, folks, and it's not reality. Because we have to really ask what really is the goal here, right? Is it going from poverty to wealth or from working class to stable middle class? Because, as we mentioned, the data does look different depending on a lot of factors, and a lot of people want to, I guess, also move the goalpost on success to let that myth survive even when large wealth jumps remain rare. Large wealth jumps being if you go from poverty to being a billionaire, right? Most people, if anything, can go from poverty to comfortable middle class, and comfortable middle class could be decent five figures.
Right. And it can even get you to the low end of the six figures, right? Because let's be real, that's not as much money as it used to be, right? Like even being in the lower six, like kind of can put you in an odd situation. But yeah, it kind of feeds into the American dream almost intersecting with something called optimism bias. And now optimism bias is actually a good thing, right? Like full hear that. It's not always bad. However, it can be misleading. So they wanted to understand the prediction of future outcomes, like how people try to predict that. And the summary of it is that people really do overestimate positive outcomes for themselves. And it explains the persistence of a belief despite the data. Because when it comes down to it, it is not as simple as you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps and become a millionaire. But what's funny is it is kind of the intersection of this optimism bias with the American dream myth that gets it. So most people actually don't support taxing the rich more sometimes because you think, well, I'm going to be rich one day and I don't want all of those taxes. But the thing is, guys, is even if you're rich, you're still going to be fine with those tax amounts. Like there's no tax amount that should be made to make somebody unlivable, right? To not be able to live. And that's not what anybody's asking for with the rich. We're just saying maybe own 10 less boats and a handful of less houses, right? Can we also acknowledge that you don't need to own and buy constantly? Although, again, that goes against kind of our marketing narrative here in America land. But I did find it interesting of kind of the intersection of the American dream and the optimism bias is if you've ever wondered why people vote against their interest, it might have something to do with that. It might have something to do with the fact that they don't view it as voting against their interest when they are convinced that it is possible for them to be in that demographic one day.
Also, too, I think it boils down to not taking the time to research some of this stuff. What do I mean by that? In the 2000s, George W. Bush was fighting against, and I forgot what this type of tax was specifically called, but it was the tax on wealth and like property and stuff that survivors of people that passed away would have to pay for like properties of their parents or grandparents or something like that, and they ultimately called it the death tax. They called it the death tax to try to get the average people to contact their senators to their congress people to vote against keeping it in place, when at the end of the day the only people that were going to benefit by this quote unquote death tax going away were the rich people, because again, they were able to, the benefit being for them was that, when that went away, and I believe it did, they, their descendants would not have to pay any sort of taxes on, like the property that they, gave in a will to a family member or their inheritance money or something like that. The
Yeah.
average person on the street has nothing to do with that particular type of tax whatsoever, yet it was sold to the American public that this affects you and it is bad and it was 100% wrong. And then that's we some people sometimes I find myself like having to remind myself like this is why we're in the state we're in this country, because people don't want to take that extra time to do that research to find out what is being sold here. And yeah, on top of that optimism myth, it's the American public does not want to take that time to do their research to find out whether something is good or not, for their politicians to do.
Right, because the death tax was their cute little rebrand to try to put people against what was called the federal estate tax. And the
Yes.
thing that was misleading, because you go back to Bush and Texas and my hood, is that it almost got pitched to sound like that it was going to apply to the small homes, to the homes that were intergenerational and thereby owned. And that way, because the argument was you already got taxed once, but it really only applied to big estates. So it didn't even really do what it said it was going to do, but yet it has still been successfully applied. I think I saw really quickly that it got repealed briefly at some point. I wasn't living there anymore. But yeah, it's still, as far as I understand, in swing and successfully being branded as it's double taxing for these rich people. And I feel like it's one of those things that anytime somebody starts to question, well, why is it only helping the rich? Trickle down economy gets thrown right back out there, even though there's nothing supporting that that's working. And then you also said something interesting about research here is that the fact that where you're born in the US matters, like a big amount, right? And that was called the Equal Opportunity Project, that they figured that out because they wanted to measure economic mobility. And the summary of that is that upward mobility in the US is lower than expected and it varies by geography. But this does challenges effort only explanations of success because it's not just who you are and how hard you're trying, it is physically where are you trying from that can matter, that a lot of people don't realize. So unless you can pick up your little bootstraps at about 10 or so and move while you're still schooling age to a certain zip code, your chances of kind of breaking out of some of these economic what is it called, like economic basically patterns in your house and your in your families, if you're going to break that cycle, you have to be able to move. And it's not just that easy to move. I mean, especially when you've got kids. When you've got kids, it's harder. So you can even have this knowledge of going, well, the baby Reverend would do much better in this zip code. There's a chance of becoming a successful and better off person. It's just not that easy, right? Because this even compounds with our housing issue that you can't always find either an apartment or a house in those locations because they're more expensive to live there too.
I think too. I mean, I know that in the late '90s there was a movie called Slums of Beverly Hills that was about a family that moved into a hotel room so they could send their kids to a school in Beverly Hills. But that type of stuff happens in real life, and you also hear stories. And do I have one off the top of my head at the moment? No, I do not. Maybe we can do one for a too long didn't read at some point. But there are definitely stories of parents that tried to at the very least have a different mailing address because, because of how schools are set up in a geographical area where where your zip code is important and will depend on which school you go to. So they will have a different address so they can send their kid to a better school. But then if the schools find out, then the parents are the ones that end up getting in trouble and could face some legal repercussions. And I believe if the story I'm remembering is true, I believe in some cases it involves jail time depending on the school. Now, again, I will do some research and, future Tim, you got some work ahead of you to find that particular story. But, it can be a big deal where you live. And, if anything can show you that that it is not fair for everybody across the board. I think that alone should be one indicator to people.
Right. It's one of the arguments for the voucher system, by the way, is that it shouldn't necessarily be tied to like a location. Like essentially, if you are able to get your child to that school, and I'm sure there's like more complications in the background of how to apply and use those vouchers in areas that actually do that system and don't just do districting. But that's why, like some of those districting conversations, and if you're not involved in your midterm elections, you lose voting how they draw those districts for schools. Like you can lose that. So, another little side tangent of why it's important to pay attention to voting, not just every presidential election year. You got to do your midterms as well because that's when you're voting for a lot of this school stuff. But besides,
Yeah, and the numbers show that in the midterms, the more people, the most people that vote during the midterms are going to be the older people that don't necessarily have kids, and they're not necessarily going to be voting in an altruistic way. They're going to be voting for their own interest, and if they feel like a tax increase to help, the schools get a little bit more money is going to affect them, even if that only means like $30 more a year or something like that, they will generally vote no.
but I can't blame them for that because they are on very restricted incomes. So they have to very much think about their survival through the end of their years, right? I know $30 a month does not sound like a lot to you, but I can speak from experience and talking to my mother-in-law and anybody else that has been on that adjusted fixed income being retired. Boy, does $30 a month make a huge difference in whether or not you can live comfortably.
And for people like that, I can look the other way, but there are also plenty of people in the boomer generation that do have tons of cash, tons of whatever, and $30 would not be anything to them. For
I'd
people like
challenge
that.
tons. I would so challenge tons. I don't feel like it's that much anymore. And I haven't looked it up, but feel free if you want to check that. If that's a thing in your head, because I know I've heard it before too, but I just with our elder care epidemic we've been talking about, I'm finding that maybe that might not be truth, Tim. I think that's something that we are being told so that it's us versus them. Because remember, there are people who really want us to blame other people for shit. So I could just sorry, I didn't mean to like. I felt like that was super rude of me to like interject at that level, but I'm like, I don't know. I feel like I would question that instinct. I
Well,
really
that's
would.
that's why I love you. Anyway.
It's a long cry from how we used to say only the Sith deal in absolutes, Tim.
Yes. All right, let's get back to the talk here. Now, we want to talk about some of those structural advantages invisible boosts that people do have, because the racing analogy I gave, the starting line isn't equal for everybody, and there are plenty of factors, whether it be family wealth, educational access, social networks. In the United States, we got to put it out there. Race, sadly, we got to put that out there. Studies consistently show that a majority of jobs are filled through personal connections, not open applications. If your parents are professionals, your network starts stacked. First generation workers often have the skills, but not the access, and no one talks about that as a structural disadvantage. One example I can bring up, that easily showcases this is Hollywood. There are plenty of instances of people, whether it be in front of the camera or behind the camera, that have children and their children's children get into the industry. And a lot of them are called Nepo babies. Like one I can think of is Dakota Johnson. Her parents are Don Johnson and Melanie Griffith. Her grandmother was Tippi Hedren, who was in The Birds and was the star of this bizarre movie called Roar. I don't know if you've heard about that.
I haven't. Sorry.
Yeah, it was filmed by Tippi Hedren's husband at the time. They wanted to care for tigers and wild animals and stuff like that, but they thought they could do that on their own property, on their own. And they filmed this movie called Roar that they thought would be a happy, uplifting movie. But, what happens when you have a bunch of wild tigers and lions? They're going to do wild tigers and lions things. And like people got, like multiple people got seriously hurt, Melanie Griffith included. Like, I think she got her face slashed by a lion and had to have like cosmetic surgery to fix it up and everything like that. But there's a great podcast called What Went Wrong, that did an episode on that particular movie, and I would definitely recommend checking it out. Great podcast. But again, the reason I brought up that family was because of the fact that because they were in the industry, like Tippi Hedren was able to, talk to her agent and say, my daughter wants to be an actress. Can you check out her work? Great. And, Melanie Griffith went on from there. And then the same thing for Dakota Johnson, which people want to throw out that Nepo baby term, and like on the one hand, yeah, Dakota Johnson did have some ins in the industry that I do not. But that doesn't mean that she's automatically going to be a major success. I mean, I think she's considered successful now relatively, but who knows 20 years from now, but she's still in the industry, folks. She had that in. But think about the people who want to be like construction workers and then are able to get into the construction business because they have a family member in it, or plumbers or carpentry or whatever. There are plenty of businesses out there that, because they have family members in it, they're able to get into it much easier than somebody just starting out with no experience, no connections whatsoever.
Right. And there's a little thing out there called cumulative advantage that was studied by one Robert K. Merton. It also has this cute little nickname called the Matthew effect. And I'll get into that in a minute because that was fun to learn. But basically, it was studied to explain inequality growth, right? And essentially, it's those small advantages that compound over time. And really, success builds on prior advantage. And now that can come to scale, right? That even comes down to, say, my little daydream of owning my food truck one day. If the baby Reverend wants to get into the food truck and really likes the food industry, it's reasonable to understand that he will have a leg up in that industry, either just because of knowledge obtained by probably helping me work sometimes, or if it's successful enough that I can pass down to him. That's part of that smaller scale cumulative effect. But essentially, it's the Matthew effect is more talking about the social mechanism where initial advantages such as, which you just laid out, fame, wealth, or talent, those compound over time, allowing those with early success to acquire more while the disadvantaged fall further behind. And this was back in 1968, Robert Merton's review and looking into all of this. What's really funny is it came up as the Matthew effect as well, and I can't help but giggle. Um, really quick though, the whole founding was basically that saying of the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. That's where that concept came from. But the name actually originates from the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew 13:12 is what this got tied to, and that says, "For whoever has will be given more; whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them." And so it is the phenomena that dictates that small early differences in performance can result in massive, disproportionate advantages later in life, often acting as a key driver for structural inequality. So, funny little biblical tie-in there that I did not mean to stumble upon. I know that's one of my little nerd things is religious philosophy. So I just thought it was super funny that this got tied to the book of Matthew. Again, talking about how this could happen.
And it's weird too, the advantages that people have that you don't want to consider, I guess, like take rich people alone. There are plenty of jobs out there that you have to start in the industry via like unpaid internship. Like, radio has that, television has that. And it's unfortunate because like someone in my position, if I were in my 20s in my current financial state, I would not be able to take advantage of an unpaid internship because interns at, places like that do work essentially full-time jobs, but they're not getting paid for it. It's the opportunity to quote unquote learn, even though a lot of times they're off getting coffee or something like that. But that's part of how you get into the industry. But if you have rich parents that can subsidize your apartment while you do one of these unpaid internships, guess what? That's an extra advantage that you did not have. That's you being able to start that 100-meter dash race at the 50-meter line. That does not take away from the work that you do because like I mentioned, unpaid interns, no matter what the industry is, do a lot of work. And I'm not diminishing that work, but that is an advantage that they had that most people don't. And that has to be acknowledged, and I know there is some push to make sure that stuff like internships do have some sort of a base salary to it. I know companies that are fighting against that, but it's thanks to privilege that some people are able to take advantage of that, and some people, if they don't have that privilege, are not able to get their foot in the door in certain industries that they want to get into, and that is sad. I think that is one thing that we could change to make the playing field more level for people. And I think ultimately too, what I've discovered in, helping get this episode together is like, I think we should be shooting for leveling the playing field as much as possible and not making it to where, because it's not going to be a reality that everybody has the same type of advantage. I go back to the episode we did with your friend Elias when we talked about trans people in sports and all that. And we talked about how, stuff like the NFL, it's like they don't look for parity. They look for, are the people that are going to be on this team able to essentially do the job, I guess, because if they look for absolute parity, all the teams would be 8-8 at the end of the season. And what type of fun would that be? But if everybody had the same level playing field, at least they would have a chance.
Right.
I think
And
that's the
that's
point.
where I do think and this is where I don't think all social media is evil because I think of LinkedIn. LinkedIn really kind of helped with some of those connections as far as like your office jobs and some of your more professional settings, right? Like it allows you to just go and add somebody at a company that you kind of like, right? And then you can talk to them and you can even establish an internet or professional level relationship with them without actually having to meet all those criteria of having happened to have met them or having happened to have ended up at some networking event where you meet them physically, right? Like there are some ways that you can branch out and be better known, and social media can help fill some of those gaps, but it definitely isn't going to correct for everything in this, right?
Correct. And it would not be realistic to expect that, there are going to be solutions out there that will fix everything and make it to where everybody has that absolute level, has that absolute chance at, success or whatever. I mean, we're not going to be able to, the world's problems are not all going to be solved, but, I think we can look to make things more fair because as we mentioned, at the times in our history to where, more people did have the opportunity to, let's say, buy a home in the 50s, the playing field was a lot more level because of the 91% tax rate in the frontier days, thanks to the Homestead Act and, railroads being built. People had a lot more opportunity to head west to, build up their dreams or whatever at that point compared to if they just did it on their own. Doesn't mean they would not have been able to necessarily pull it off, of course, but you get my point. They had advantages that people don't necessarily have.
Exactly. And if we don't acknowledge those advantages, we actually can't compensate for them properly. If we don't stop lying to ourselves about how people succeed, like how they truly succeed, we're not going to be able to help the poor demographic pull themselves up by their bootstraps. I like keeping going back to that because pointing out how ridiculous it was at the beginning of the show. And effectively, if we're bringing attention to it, then they're not pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. We are helping by making a cultural correction. And that's kind of what probably really needs to happen at this point. And if we really want to shorten this divide between our 1% very, very wealthy people, our upper class, our middle class, which is disappearing still. Last I remember hearing, that is very much disappearing. And that is because we all got convinced that these subsidies weren't needed because of concepts like pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, which is just not working the longer it goes on. And the longer we keep perpetuating this myth that we can do it all ourselves, and granted, I get it. It feels really good to believe you got that much control over your life, but you have to anchor that in some reality if even you want to have success for yourself and your future generations, if you're out there and if you've got kids.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, even people in like six-figure salaries, or even seven-figure salaries, may be like one catastrophic incident away from losing everything. That is
Right.
a fact. And if we continue to go along with this myth that we can do it on our own and we don't have to rely upon the government, we don't have to have these services, we don't need to pay for them, then by the time you have to start taking advantage of them, they may not be there. Which doesn't mean I'm again promoting this idea that we should just throw money at something and not have any sort of stewardship over it. We shouldn't have make sure it's doing what it's intended to do and all that. But like we need these social programs out there so that people, when they do face some catastrophic circumstances in their lives, don't find themselves homeless. I mean, when you live in a big city like Portland, even in the neighborhood I live in, you see the homeless situation for what it is, and it's sad. And there are people that if the government were helping as much as they have had in the past, wouldn't necessarily find themselves in a spot to where they even have to consider that.
Right. There is almost half of adults in the US that openly say that they would struggle to cover something like a $400 emergency. It's not accurate to say that most Americans would be completely impoverished, if not homeless, if they had a major medical event, but many of them. And when you consider how little control we have over those things happening, that is devastating. So I could see an easy argument here is even if we just socialized medicine, that could help reduce our homeless factor, because as much as it is easy to say, well, it is their fault because they didn't do enough, the likelihood is it was something completely outside of their control that put them in the situation to no longer have a home.
Yeah.
Super likely to say that.
Yeah, like how dare you get cancer? I mean,
Right. Or how dare you get hit by a car while you were abiding all of the laws, but they decided texting on their phone was far more important than pay attention at that roundabout, or to that stop sign is stupid because nobody's there. I totally paused. That's not your fault. And yet you are the one that is going to pay in those situations. And I'm not saying that's all of our medical accidents or all of our medical bills or like those things. These are just examples of it's not necessarily their fault, and especially random illness. Like, that's not their fault, but yet that easily gets turned into a narrative of, yes, it is because you should have taken better care of yourself. If you had done all of the things and eaten your vegetables and done the whole happy plate and the pyramid or whatever rendition it is today, because now we're supposed to be eating beef tallow, I guess. Um, like, this idea that if you had done everything right, you wouldn't be in this position. And it is just so impermeated into the way that we think of stuff. And granted, it goes to that's that bad side of optimism bias. That optimism bias wants to tell you that you can control enough to have a good outcome. But the reality of the situation, and one of the studies that we'll get into when we revisit this and we come back for part 2, is that it's really not that simple. And we do need to have like an anchored, tempered understanding of the actual facts if we really want to break these cycles in our culture.
Turn off the mute. We are going to have.
That's funny. I was like, I can't hear you. Is it me?
Yeah, no, it was me. Yeah, we are going to cut things off right here, folks. Like we listen to the show ourselves, and what we want to do is give you folks chance to absorb all this information in an appropriate time. And, 2-hour episodes are great, but we don't want to do that every single week. So we are going to cut things off right here and continue our conversation on next week. So I think we'll just end it here. Each Monday, we'll have something in this podcast space to entertain your ear holes. Until we meet again, we bid you adieu.
Just pull yourself up by them bootstraps and make yourself listen to our long episodes. Dang it. No, I'm just kidding. We're going to cut it out. I think it's good for you guys. So we'll talk to you next week.
Yes. And remember, turn the mute button off.
Turn the mute button off.
Subscribe to Friends Talking Nerdy
on YouTube Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify,
or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Bye, friends.